morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is week 6 of the history of the fashion in the long 19th century, and we are continuing our discussion of the female fashions in the 5 major styles. So we have covered neoclassicism and romanticism, and today it's time to talk about the Victorian fashion. Queen Victoria's reign was record-breaking, so it will cover more than just one style, but we will talk about the early Victorian fashion and then the age of the crinoline. So the accession of Queen Victoria in June 1837 came when she was only 18 years old, and as you remember, it occurred after several decades of very severe image crisis of the British royal family. The reigns of Victoria's predecessors, her uncles, have been vilified. The kings George IV and William IV were called the wicked uncles by the political commentators, and generally the mood of the society was changing, and something needed to be done to improve the public relations of the royal family. So Victoria seems to have understand that, and her outlook is essentially serious. This was a reaction towards the more disreputable and frivolous aspects of behaviors associated with the wicked uncles. So everything that was too extravagant, too flashy, started being avoided. By the mid-1830s, the leading social role of the middle class was more or less secure. So the middle class became dominant as a social, political and economical force. If you remember our discussion of Biedermeier on the continent after the fall of Napoleon, and actually it continues longer than the romanticism in England. The Biedermeier normally lasts until the revolutions of 1848, whereas in Britain the accession of Queen Victoria is seen as a very important turning point in culture in general. Mostly because the Queen and her husband Prince Albert had to or decided to, perhaps not fully consciously, but adopt the set of values associated with the middle class. The values of hard work, self-improvement, respectability, and also family values, so the traditional gender roles and sexual morality associated with the middle class as well. So they started, Victoria and Albert, not only raising a very large family. They had 9 children together. They will be important, especially the princesses, as let's say fashion conscious aristocratic ladies later on, but generally Victoria's reign is characterized by what some political commentators called the middle class monarchy. They set an example. They set an example of family life, of modesty and hard work. So what we have in fashion are two very important aspects that are really visible in the early 40s and later. So general conservatism of the look. So everything that was conservative in the romantic fashion, conservative meaning traditionally feminine, alluding to traditional patriarchal structure of the society in which women were mostly ornamental, in which femininity was praised mostly as leading to motherhood. So women, including Queen Victoria, were presented as faithful wives and good mothers and hard-working managers of homes. This was kept, so the general silhouette consisting of a natural waist, so a small waist, especially emphasized by the corset, a tightly fitting bodice, plus a full skirt. A full skirt, of course, emphasizing the hips, and the hips being associated with maternity and femininity. This was kept, so the general hourglass silhouette, also emphasized by the use of the corset and other dress improvers. As you will see, the crinoline really works towards the same purpose. But at the same time, everything that was too individualistic, too extravagant, too bold or sophisticated was avoided, and some things like those big sleeves or very elaborate hats were going out of fashion rather quickly. So within a few years, really, between the late 30s and early 40s, you have the situation that young women, sometimes as young as the Queen herself, appear or present the image of a more mature and responsible woman, a kind of young matron, whereas older women, who, as we have already discussed earlier, generally have a tendency to dress a little bit behind the times and to follow the fashions of their younger years, they looked more youthful and frivolous than the young women from the generation of the Queen herself. So this is something quite interesting, because this is the moment that really shows you the transparency of fashion, the way that fashion works psychologically. But of course, in time, the sober, modest, bourgeois vision of femininity took over. So the ideal of a lady really changed. Women were supposed to present ideals of gentility, modesty. Their expected social roles in life were to be dependent on men, to be passive, to be confined to the sphere of the home and family. So rather than trying to look sophisticated and individualistic, they tried to look shy, modest, serious, to present the image of this kind of traditional Christian-inspired, mostly goodness and sweetness. It's no coincidence, for example, that in 1854 a very important long poem was published by a man called Coventry Patmore. The poem itself is not so well remembered, but the title of this poem became really common parlance in the 19th century and is still used to denote this idea of a lady. This title is The Angel in the House. So the Victorian lady was supposed to be the angel in the house. So on one hand, sweet, modest and serious; on the other hand, confined to the family sphere, to the private sphere, whereas men, of course, were more active in society. They were expected to work professionally. They were expected to leave the home after breakfast to go to work, and they didn't really spend a lot of time at home with their families. So this is a very interesting observation, that we have at the same time the novelty and traditionalism. So those traditional aspects of romanticism are kept, everything excessive is abandoned. The first thing to go was, of course, the sleeve. The sleeves, as you noticed in the previous week, they start to deflate in the second half, or basically in the 30s. They start to deflate. So the fullness of the leg of mutton sleeve goes downwards along the sleeve from the level of the shoulders, then below the shoulder, then to the elbow, and then eventually it becomes the kind of reversed leg of mutton sleeve, which is the fullest at the wrist. But then again the sleeves become simple and narrow and generally unadorned. Slightly later, the sleeves, the fashionable sleeves, are opened at the wrist, so they create something that was called the pagoda effect, the pagoda sleeves. So wide open sleeves that would very often be complemented by additional, normally white cuffs or undersleeves. These undersleeves are called engageants. This is a French word, and they are a very popular element of Victorian fashion. You will see it in very many fashion plates. They are, of course, the association with cleanliness and neatness. The white cuffs and white collars are still very popular. So when the sleeves start to deflate, the same happens to the hairstyles. The Apollo knot on top of the head is replaced by a knot moving to the back of the head rather than staying at the top. So generally most hairstyles used the hair divided into three parts: the central parting, two sides, and the back of the hair that was coiled into some sort of knot. Generally, adult women did not wear their hair long or loose. The only exception for a time was something that survived kind of from the later Romantic period, were the ringlets. I mentioned the ringlets last time, but this is really the fashion that becomes extremely popular in the 1840s with the early Victorian style. So the central parting and the two sides of the hair next to the face were curled into vertical curls and arranged on the sides of the face. And these curls could be quite long sometimes, even though long hair was associated with children, with girls rather than women. That is why this fashion didn't really last very long, because it projected contradictory symbolic meanings. On one hand, when it was fashionable, it was popularly used and it denoted elegance and beauty and sophistication. On the other hand, longer hair was still very strongly associated with childhood, with the kind of hairstyles that young teenagers would wear before they were introduced into the adult society. So there were other possibilities, like the style that you may recall from this very early portrait of Queen Victoria. So the hair at the sides of the face would not be curled, but it would be braided or sometimes arranged in the kind of folded loops on the sides of of the face. But whatever the arrangement of the front of the hair, the back would be a small coil at the back of the head. The bonnets also start getting simplified. It takes a bit of time, so the early Victorian bonnets, the kind of bonnets worn by Victoria in the first years of her reign, still tend to be quite decorative and have relatively broad brims, so circling the face. But then the bonnets get simplified. The most typical kind of a Victorian bonnet is the so-called poke bonnet, which was like a tubular construction with no visible transition point between the crown and the brim. Of course, it would still be decorated with ribbons. Normally bonnets were fastened below the chin, so they had those ribbons or streamers that might be decorated with lace or artificial flowers or other ornaments, but not as heavily as the earlier romantic bonnets. One more thing that really becomes very popular with the Victorian, the most typical Victorian poke bonnet, is the so-called bavolet. A bavolet is a little flounce, like a little curtain at the back of the neck. So the idea was to cover the back of the neck. So when a lady wore this kind of bonnet, her neck would not be visible from the back. The reason, of course, modesty. This is one of those Victorian elements of fashion that point to the importance of modesty and respectability and such things. Another very popular element of the early Victorian fashion is the change in the construction of the dress. Some dresses were still made in one piece with the back fastening, usually with many hooks and eyes, metal hooks and eyes. Later, from the 40s onwards, two-piece dresses become more popular. They were more practical, they were easier to put on. You could have, as you saw in one of the earlier parts, you could have two or more different bodices, like a separate bodice for day and for evening wear with the same skirt. So they would be made either in the same fabric or matching fabrics. Usually it was the same, so you wouldn't really see the difference between a one-piece dress and a two-piece dress. Bodices as such become simplified. They are still very tight, so they emphasize the figure. But increasingly they are drawn to a point in front. So rather than have a round waist, the waist is kind of adorned with this kind of point that sometimes looks like an inverted Gothic arch. So it's kind of, you know, another Gothic, which means historicizing element. So full skirts and those pointed bodices, and very often, especially in evening dresses that would have the lower décolletage and short sleeves, we have a broad flat collar. It was called a Bertha collar. That would be like a very big flat flounce, sometimes completely straight, sometimes also a little pointed towards the middle of the décolletage. This is like the typical look of the 1840s. The ringlets, the Bertha collar, the pointed bodice, and a full long dress. The walking length dresses go out of fashion. Dresses really basically are floor length, even for daytime. They also denote maturity and respectability. So the fullness of the skirt is achieved as before by layering multiple petticoats, sometimes using the crinoline, that is the stiffer petticoat made of horsehair fabric, something that will later in the mid-50s be replaced by the crinoline frame, that is the construction made of metal and fabric, that would actually limit the necessity of petticoats to just a few, while allowing the wearer to achieve a very similar full or even fuller effect. So that's a very, very typical early Victorian style. And if we look at the fashion plates, it's quite visible. So one thing that you notice from the very, very early on is the growing difference, like almost contrast between the clothes for men and women. So women during the day wore light colored dresses, men wore darker cloth. Women wore cottons mostly, sometimes silks in the evening. Men normally would wear woolen fabrics. Everything about a man, we'll talk about it when we really talk about the men's fashion through the long 19th century. This is just to indicate, because you have some fashion plates featuring gentlemen as well. So darker colors, stronger materials. The top hats really dominate the scene. They become something of an urban uniform of a middle class man. They would normally be worn by the middle class and upwards, rather than the working class. The working class would wear other softer caps. Later on they would wear bowler hats that were actually invented as workwear for protection of the construction workers. But top hats with very long, tall crowns that would add height to a gentleman. So again, emphasize the traditionally understood masculinity. They take over the Victorian fashion for men, absolutely. If we look at the portraiture, we have the beautiful and the long career of one of the greatest portraitists of Europe in the 19th century, the German artist Franz Xaver Winterhalter. And you will see many of his portraits today. The first one here is of a French duchess, and she is wearing quintessential early Victorian style with the ringlets, the Bertha collar, the pointed bodice and the long full skirt. So Winterhalter was a great portraitist of nobility, and especially beautiful, fashionably dressed ladies from the royal and noble courts of Europe, and he struck a very good rapport with Victoria, who asked him to portray many members of her family and herself many times. Other royal ladies that were portrayed by Winterhalter was Empress Eugenie, the wife of of Napoleon III, the Emperor of the French. There are some very famous portraits of her, especially from the crinoline period, so from the 1850s. Also later on, the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, so-called Empress Sissi, a very fashionable, very beautiful royal lady, from one generation younger than Victoria. But if you remember the Schönheitsgalerie of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, his collection of beautiful portraits of fashionably dressed ladies continues. Here we have two more examples. Here we have a young princess. I guess this might have been his daughter even, in this portrait, wearing the quintessential early Victorian style. So long ringlets, a Bertha collar, and well, that's a very typical look. The other portrait from this set is a very interesting character called Lola Montes. She was a dancer, she was a courtesan at some time as well, and she was the one who managed to seduce King Ludwig, and eventually he married her. This was a so-called morganatic marriage, so she did not become a queen, but she became a duchess. And here we have a portrait of her from 1847, looking very modest. She was very far from being modest all her life, but you can see her wearing a simple, tightly fitting black dress with a small pretty lace collar. I don't really know why white, it wasn't popular. She was either in mourning for somebody who died, or she wanted to emphasize this kind of exotic Spanish look that she used. She wasn't Spanish, she was Irish, and we continue in a moment.